Thank you all for being here. We're going to start right away. So Nicholas, we have a system, a rights-based criminal justice system. We have the Constitution of the United States, affords every individual certain rights, and we talk about it being the most powerful democratic document in human history, arguably so. And our criminal justice system doesn't seem to reflect that. What went wrong?
Well, we should begin by talking about exactly what is wrong. I mean, I think one of the things that I would begin by describing to the audience is that we have a system that is an international aberration. We incarcerate more people than any other country on the globe. We didn't used to do that, but I'll give you an example. We incarcerate 10 times the amount of, at a rate 10 times the amount of what Germany does, for example. In the early 70s, we were at the same level as Germany and our Western European peers. And in response to the civil rights movement and what was deemed unrest in urban environments, a lot of fear-mongering started, mandatory minimums, and we took off, and our prison system grew 700% over the course of 45 years. So part of what's wrong is the way we've played politics with the justice system, and the way that we have branded certain people as threats to safety, and politicians have used that for decades and decades. I think we're at a place where we are starting to change that a little bit, but that's in large part what's wrong. I think the last point that I want to make that some people don't understand is people often think, well, we have this big system because, Americans are more violent, we're more crime prone. In America today, one in every two families has had an immediate family member incarcerated within the last 10 years. Are we that criminal in this country? I don't think we are. But that shows you how much the system has grown and imposed itself on the lives of people all over the country. And it's a silent epidemic in some respects because there's a lot of stigma attached.
And of course, disproportionately affected, as in many situations, are African Americans, Hispanics, just minorities in general, seem to be crashing into the criminal justice system more often. Marc, can you tell us a little bit about why that's happening?
Well, I mean, as you said at the beginning, we have a system, rights-based system that is beautiful, that emphasizes equality, that should work if you read it on paper in a way that's fair and just. The problem is that at every stage, there's discretion. And that's where human beings come into play, where there's either error or bias. And what you see is at every single stage of the criminal justice system, dramatically disproportionate effects on people of color. So whether it's arrest, so with policing, whether it's who gets charged versus who might get sent home with a warning to their parents, who gets convicted, what their sentence is, the length of sentence, even when they're in prison, who gets sent to solitary confinement, how people are treated in prison, the chances of parole, and then the chances of success upon reentry. At every single stage, there are discriminatory impacts. And so that's something that we need to reckon with, which is this rights-based system that sounds fair and just versus discretion at every stage that leads to these different results. And that's a huge problem.
One point just to make about this rights-based system is that the rights are interpreted in a pretty hollow way. So I'll give you an example. In the Constitution, the Eighth Amendment bars cruel and unusual punishment. Yet the way the courts interpret it is such that we can have in this country 100,000 people who are held in solitary confinement, which internationally is recognized as a human rights violation. You're in a box, 6 by 10, 23 hours in it, 7 days a week, often for months and years. And that isn't considered a violation of the Bill of Rights protection against cruel and unusual punishment.
Either not cruel or not unusual.
It's not in America. It's not.
Not in America.
It's hollow. It's a hollow right.
So I want to follow up on that because it seems like solitary confinement, if somebody commits a crime and you throw them in the hole, it doesn't seem like that's aiming toward rehabilitation. And I want you to talk to us about the rehabilitation results of the American, the punishment side of the criminal justice system. Are we getting any results on that side?
I'll speak briefly about this, and I know that Marc has a lot to say on it as well. I mean, a lot of people presume, and you look at the names of, corrections agencies around the country. I mean, the Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, but in fact, they're not constructed to be that way. They've been constructed around an ideology of retribution and punishment and incapacitation, putting people away, putting them away for a long time, not deeming them to be treated as human beings. And so we haven't invested in a system that is seriously intent on healing or addressing deficits that people might have and helping them to get better. I'll give you a quick story. The Vera Institute of Justice often takes people to Germany and Norway to look at their prison systems. And one day we took a bunch of corrections administrators to a prison in northeast Germany, and we said, look, we want to see your solitary confinement wing. They said, well, why? I said, well, we're just curious to see what that looks like. And we walked in there and it was empty. We said, well, why is it empty? He said, well, we very rarely use it. Well, how much have you used it? Well, 4 times in this year, and it was June of that year. He said, well, how long do people stay in there? I said, well, for a few hours at a time just to cool down.
Time out.
And that's because in those countries, there's a recognition that that's not rehabilitation. That is punishment and control and dehumanizing. And unfortunately, it's a convention that we have in this country.
Yeah, if I could add on this point.
Please.
Yeah, solitary confinement in this country is given out like candy. People who are in prison, you'd think that they might be going for a stabbing or a violent incident, but it's anything that might be just talking back to an officer. I know somebody who went to solitary confinement for stealing a plate of vegetables, all right? This was considered an offense, okay? I would love it if my kids would do that kind of thing, frankly. Solitary confinement is a huge problem and a human rights violation that takes place every single day. And I'm someone who spends multiple days a week inside of prisons and jails. And I often ask people, how much time they spent in solitary. And almost everybody has been there, and often for months and sometimes for years. But in terms of rehabilitation, we have the solutions at our fingertips. We can solve this problem of criminal justice and ultimately recidivism, which is by providing positive programming, by treating people with respect in prison, by giving them educational opportunities, vocational opportunities. They will transform. And when they come home, as 95% of people who are incarcerated will do, we always need to remember that. When they come home, they'll be prepared to succeed in society. So we can do it, we just have to have the will to do it. Unfortunately, there have been an increasing number of programs, and mine at Georgetown is a part of that, that are recognizing this, that are getting support from philanthropists and foundations and others, but we need to be doing this everywhere, in every single prison. And then we won't have a crime problem, we won't have a recidivism problem, we won't have a criminal justice problem, so we can solve it.
Pushing back on this, there is a perception, and part of it might be driven by Hollywood and TV, and part of it is driven by very real concerns put forth by peace officers. And basically officers working in prisons sometimes fear for their own lives and argue that they have to use these very extreme tools for their own safety. Does that argument hold water in your experience?
If I can answer that.
Please.
In my experience, it holds water if you have set up a prison under conditions where people have nothing to do, no activities, nothing positive, where they're all day being poked in the eye, right, in their little cages. If you do that to a dog and then the dog comes out and bites you, you're not going to be surprised. But we're doing that to human beings. But if you treat people with respect and give them positive, productive things to do, guess what? They don't assault officers. They don't talk back. They're actually wonderful to deal with. And one of the things that we've experienced in our program at the DC jail, and I heard within just a few weeks of us starting a pilot program at the very beginning. Now we're offering credits and ultimately degrees. We've really moved along. But from the very beginning, I heard there's a culture change. People are no longer violent. People are now talking about philosophy, and they're having debates and discussions and using their words. So this is a solution that actually makes the prison itself run much more smoothly for staff. So there's so many reasons why we should be doing this. and there's cost reasons and public safety reasons as well.
I think that's a great point. I mean, if we treat people inhumanely, then that's what you can expect to get back from them in return. I mean, all of this sounds deeply depressing, but I think that we're actually where we are starting to move in this country in a different direction. I mean, we should recognize that everything we've talked about is true. We have a terrible system that historically has treated people very badly, that has imposed its burdens on poor people and people of color far more pronouncedly than others. But we're also at a moment now where there's increasing bipartisan support for reform.
And that's an interesting point. I mean, we did see a criminal justice reform in this presidency. It's, along with USMCA, the only big bipartisan bill that's been signed into law this year. Where do you start moving the needle? What are the policy? Is the federal government where you move the needle? Is it at the state level, at the local level?
The federal government has a role to play. The First Step Act was a good first step. But I think some of the important things need to happen. The First Step Act was mostly about rehabilitating people in prison, letting a small group of people out earlier. What we need to be focusing on much more is how you shrink the footprint of the system. So close down the wide part of the funnel that is driving people into the system is a hugely important thing. Our system is not a system. It is actually, it's driven by, 90% of the population in American jails and prisons are state and local. But the federal government still can play a role. It can incentivize, it can model, and so there's work to be done at all levels of government. But I think we have to start increasingly with greater rehabilitation, as the First Step Act started to do. But we really have to lean very hard into how to shrink that wide end of the funnel. We arrest in this country 11 million people a year. That's an amazing statistic. That's a decision that law enforcement makes about its interaction with the public, and that number needs to, that is a big driver of why we see so many people in jail and prison.
Focusing on who is arrested, we're running out of time, but I do want you to make the point. This idea of the nonviolent drug offender. It's been thrown around in politics a lot. Is there such a thing as a category of violent drug offender, a nonviolent drug offender? What does this even mean?
Let me just make a quick point about the states, because I agree with Nick that that's really where the action is. 90% of criminal cases are at the state level. But there's also a lot of bipartisanship that's been emerging there, whether it's blue states like New York, New Jersey, California that have drastically reduced their prison population by 20-25%, but also Texas, Georgia, Louisiana, red states where it's happening. And so there's this bipartisan consensus is really having an influence on states. In terms of the violent and nonviolent, that is a convenient myth that people in society and many politicians have driven to say, oh, they're sort of good criminals that we can therefore let out because they were nonviolent drug offenders. And the myth is that that's widespread in the majority of people versus bad violent offenders. The reality is that there are many people who committed violent crimes, often a long time ago, and they are capable of transformation and rehabilitation and successful reentry. The evidence actually proves that, but the rhetoric, which is still fear-based, as Nick said, that drove this country for 40 years, and it's still there. It's not as prominent, but it's still lurking there. We need to talk about actual human transformation and stop coming up with these simple dichotomies that are actually false.
Very quickly to end this, in your research and experience and meeting prisoners, how many prisoners have you met that you would say are not worth attempting to rehabilitate?
Well, I would say no one is not worthy of attempting to rehabilitate, for sure. But I will concede that there are some, and there may be psychological trauma and disorders that perhaps will make it difficult, if not impossible. But that's a very small percentage. I think that most people are redeemable. Most people, if given the support and opportunity, can actually transform. And I've seen it with my own eyes. I've seen people who have served decades in prison for horrible crimes, and people I would trust with my own family, in my own neighborhood, and I have absolute faith in that. And I know that might sound far-fetched, and there's a big gap that I don't have time to explain, but I honestly believe that the vast majority of people can be redeemed and can succeed.
Well, I think that's as good as any time to end this, and we're out of time. So thank you so much. Please.
Thanks.